Silas Bond signed the humiliating document with a confident grin that didn't match the situation, while Josephine sat across the antique desk, soaking in her own ruthlessness. In her mind, she had just successfully firewalled her corporate assets and hard-earned millions from a husband she secretly feared was just dead weight. But Silas didn't look defeated. He sat there in his crisp blue suit, his eyes fixed on hers with a look of amusement that Josephine found deeply unsettling. The private calls he took in the garden, the expensive watch she never bought him, and his terrifyingly easy compliance with her demands to sign away his rights all masked a devastating truth that was about to turn Josephine's perfectly controlled world upside down. What would happen when Josephine finally realized that the prenup she forced him to sign didn't protect her fortune from him, but actually cut her off from a dynasty that made her millions look like pocket change? Before we watch her worlds crumble, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you love a story where karma hits hard, hit that like button and tell me where you're watching from, New York, London, or maybe Ottawa. Now, let's step into the hidden life of Silas Bond. The evening air inside the Bond residence was always chilled, a temperature Josephine insisted kept the mind sharp, but tonight it felt particularly biting. The dining room, with its high ceilings and walls lined with somber portraits of strangers Josephine had bought at auction to feign ancestry, felt less like a home and more like a courtroom. Josephine sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture rigid in a sharp cream-white business suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. She drummed her manicured fingernails against the polished wood, waiting for Silas to take his seat. She had staged this dinner with the precision of a hostile corporate takeover. The lighting was dim, the staff had been dismissed for the night, and a single thick document sat ominously next to the crystal water pitcher. It was the post-nuptial agreement, technically a modification to their existing arrangement, but in reality an ironclad severance package designed to leave her husband with nothing but the clothes on his back should they divorce. Silas entered the room with that maddeningly relaxed gait of his, wearing a vibrant blue suit that seemed too cheerful for the occasion. He looked like a man who had just returned from a pleasant stroll, not a husband walking into an ambush. He pulled out the heavy oak chair opposite her, the wood scraping harshly against the floor, and offered her a warm, easy smile. "Good evening, Jo," he said, his voice carrying a depth that usually soothed her, but tonight only grated on her nerves. "You dismissed the cook early." "We need to talk, Silas," Josephine cut in, skipping the pleasantries. She didn't want small talk, she wanted surrender. With a deliberate, practiced motion, she slid the legal binder across the table. It stopped inches from his hand. "My lawyers finished the draft. It's time we formalized the boundaries of this marriage." She watched his eyes, waiting for the flicker of fear, the flare of indignation, or the defensive posturing of a man realizing his meal ticket was being threatened. She had rehearsed her counter-arguments for days. She was ready to list every time she had paid for dinner, every vacation she had funded, and the disparity between her executive salary and his modest income as a residential architect. She wanted him to argue so she could crush him with logic. Instead, Silas simply looked down at the document, then back up at her. His expression wasn't fearful. It was filled with a strange, quiet pity that made Josephine's stomach twist. "The post-nuptial," Silas said, stating the obvious without a hint of accusation. "It protects my company," Josephine said, her voice sharp. "The market is volatile. If anything happens to us, I can't have my assets tied up in litigation. It's just smart business, Silas. You of all people should understand that architecture relies on strong foundations." She despised how defensive she sounded. She was the one with the power here, yet his silence was forcing her to fill the void with justifications she shouldn't have to give. Silas reached into his jacket and produced a silver pen. He didn't open the binder to the first page. He didn't ask about the clauses regarding the house, the alimony waivers, or the strict confidentiality agreements she had added at the last minute. He didn't even put on his reading glasses. "Silas," she snapped, her patience fraying, "aren't you going to read it? My legal team can walk you through the—" "I don't need to read it, Jo. I know what it says. It says that what's yours is yours, and you want to make sure it stays that way. He flipped to the back page, the paper crinkling loudly in the silence of the room. He found the signature line marked husband, and with a fluid, confident motion, signed his name. The scratch of the pen against the paper sounded like a scream to Josephine's ears. He closed the folder and slid it back toward her. Done. Josephine stared at the document, then at him. She felt cheated. Where was the fight? Where was the greed? By signing so easily, he was robbing her of the satisfaction of exposing him. If he didn't care about the money, then her entire narrative that she was the victim of a potential gold digger collapsed. You didn't even look at the forfeiture clause, she accused, her voice rising. You just signed away your rights to the penthouse. Do you have any idea what you just did? Silas leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the table. The contrast between them was striking. Josephine, tense and coiled in her austere white suit, looking like ice. Silas, warm and relaxed in his royal blue, looking like water that simply flowed around obstacles. I think, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble, that you mistake net worth for self-worth. I signed because I don't need your money, Josephine. I never have. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before he exited. I'm going to the study. I have some calls to make. Enjoy your victory. Josephine sat alone in the vast, cold dining room, her hand resting on the binder that was supposed to be her shield. She had won. The assets were safe. The empire was secure. But as she watched her husband's retreating figure, the victory tasted like ash. Why did he look at her like she was the one losing everything? And who exactly was an architect calling at 8 o'clock on a Friday night? The questions gnawed at her, turning her triumph into the first stirrings of a paranoia that would soon consume her. The transition from the sterile designer chill of the townhouse to the hushed, oak-paneled sanctuary of Snyder and Associates was jarring, yet entirely welcome. Silas stepped out of the private elevator on the 45th floor, the city lights of Chicago sprawling beneath him like a circuit board of diamonds. Here, the air smelled lemon oil, old paper, and the kind of quiet power that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Rick Snyder was waiting for him by the window, a silhouette against the night sky. At 72, the attorney still possessed the posture of a former Marine, though his tailored suit and silver hair softened the edge. He turned as Silas entered, his expression a mixture of grief and professional gravity. It's done then? Rick asked, his voice gravelly. It's done, Silas replied, sinking into one of the wingback chairs that had likely been in this office since the building was constructed. She made me sign it before the appetizers arrived. Didn't even let me read the fine print, though I imagine you memorized it for me. Rick moved to his desk, a massive slab of walnut that was currently covered in files stamped with the Bond family crest. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, sliding one across the desk to Silas. I didn't just memorize it, Silas. I wept over it, Rick grumbled, taking a sip. Josephine's lawyers are aggressive, I'll give them that. They locked down every penny of her spa franchise and her stock portfolio. They included clauses for infidelity, laziness, and even public embarrassment. It is, without a doubt, the most airtight document I have ever seen designed to protect a millionaire from a pauper. Silas took the glass, swirling it but not drinking. She thinks she's being prudent, Rick. In her world, everyone is a shark. She just wants to be the biggest one in the tank. She's a minnow, Silas. A minnow swimming in the mouth of a whale and thinking she owns the ocean. Rick leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Does she have any idea? Any inkling at all? None, Silas said. She thinks I'm just a residential architect who got lucky marrying a CEO. She thinks the Bond name is just a coincidence, a common surname like Smith or Jones. She never asked about my family, Rick, not once in 5 years. She was too busy telling me about hers. Rick shook his head, opening the central file on his desk. Then she has effectively signed her own financial death warrant. By insisting on a total separation of assets, past, present, and future, she has legally severed herself from the Bond estate. The lawyer topped a thick stack of documents. Anthony passed peacefully, Silas, you know that. But his will was a masterclass in patience. He knew you were married to Josephine. He knew she looked down on you. That's why he locked the trust until your 45th birthday. He wanted to give her time to show you who she really was before you had the burden of the fortune. Silas looked at the portrait of his grandfather hanging behind Rick's desk. Anthony Bond had been a titan of industry, a man who built skyscrapers, shipping fleets, and entire neighborhoods, yet lived in a modest farmhouse until the day he died. He had taught Silas that money was a tool, not an identity. Money reveals character, Anthony used to say. It doesn't change people, it just turns up the volume on who they already are. The trust is active as of midnight, Rick continued, his tone shifting to business. The liquidity alone is staggering. We're talking about $3 billion in diversified holdings, another $2 billion in real estate, including the commercial sector downtown, and the controlling interest in Bond Industries. Josephine is worried about protecting $10 million, Silas. You spent that much for charitable grants last year without her even noticing. Silas finally took a sip of the drink. It burned pleasantly, grounding him. And the building? The Plaza Tower? Rick smirked, a flash of dark humor crossing his face. We closed on it this morning, through the shell company, of course. You now own the building where Josephine's headquarters are located. You are technically her landlord. If you wanted to, you could double her rent tomorrow, or evict her. The power of it sat heavily in the room. Silas didn't feel triumphant. He felt a profound, aching sadness. He had loved Josephine. He admired her drive, her fire. He had hoped that underneath the armor of her ambition, there was a partner who valued him for his mind and his heart. But tonight, she had looked at him with pity. She had treated him like a liability to be managed, a potential leak in her hull. She called me a man with no ambition, Silas said quietly. She said I let her dictate my worth. She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb, Rick scoffed. So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress, or that the disparity in knowledge renders it unconscionable. No, Silas said firmly. The prenup stands. She wanted it. She fought for it. She humiliated me to get it. I won't respect her wishes. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city his grandfather had helped build. He could see the lights of Josephine's office tower in the distance, a small pinprick in the vast skyline he now effectively controlled. She called me a man with no ambition, Silas said quietly. She said I let her dictate my worth. She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb, Rick scoffed. So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress, or that the disparity in knowledge renders it unconscionable. No, Silas said firmly. The prenup stands. She wanted it. She fought for it. She humiliated me to get it. I won't respect her wishes. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city his grandfather had helped build. He could see the lights of Josephine's office tower in the distance, a small pinprick in the vast skyline he now effectively controlled. She called me a man with no ambition, Silas said quietly. She said I let her dictate my worth. She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb, Rick scoffed. So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress, or that the disparity in knowledge renders it unconscionable. No, Silas said firmly. The prenup stands. She wanted it. She fought for it. She humiliated me to get it. I won't respect her wishes. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city his grandfather had helped build. He could see the lights of Josephine's office tower in the distance, a small pinprick in the vast skyline he now effectively controlled. She called me a man with no ambition, Silas said quietly. She said I let her dictate my worth. She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb, Rick scoffed. So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress, or that the disparity in knowledge renders that unconscionable. No, Silas said firmly. The prenup stands. She wanted it. She fought for it. She humiliated me to get it. I won't respect her wishes. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city his grandfather had helped build. He could see the lights of Josephine's office tower in the distance, a small pinprick in the vast skyline he now effectively controlled. "She called me a man with no ambition," Silas said quietly. "She said I let her dictate my worth." "She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb," Rick scoffed. "So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress or that the disparity in knowledge renders it unconscionable." "No," Silas said firmly. "The prenup stands. She wanted it. She fought for it. She humiliated me to get it. I won't respect her wishes." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city his grandfather had helped build. He could see the lights of Josephine's office tower in the distance, a small pinprick in the vast skyline he now effectively controlled. "She called me a man with no ambition," Silas said quietly. "She said I let her dictate my worth." "She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb," Rick scoffed. "So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress or that the disparity in knowledge renders it unconscionable." "No," Silas said firmly. "The prenup stands. She wanted it. She fought for it. She humiliated me to get it. I won't respect her wishes." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city his grandfather had helped build. He could see the lights of Josephine's office tower in the distance, a small pinprick in the vast skyline he now effectively controlled. "She called me a man with no ambition," Silas said quietly. "She said I let her dictate my worth." "She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb," Rick scoffed. "So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress or that the disparity in knowledge renders it unconscionable." "No," Silas said firmly. "The prenup stands. She wanted it. She fought for it. She humiliated me to get it. I won't respect her wishes." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city his grandfather had helped build. He could see the lights of Josephine's office tower in the distance, a small pinprick in the vast skyline he now effectively controlled. "She called me a man with no ambition," Silas said quietly. "She said I let her dictate my worth." "She's staring at the sun and calling it a light bulb," Rick scoffed. "So what is the play, Silas? Do we tell her? Do we void the prenup based on non-disclosure of your assets? I can argue you signed under duress or that the disparity in knowledge renders it unconscionable." 3 weeks had passed since the signing of the post-nuptial agreement, and the silence in the Bond household had curdled into something thick and suffocating. Josephine had expected the document to act as a reset button, a legal exorcism that would banish her insecurities and restore the equilibrium where she was the benevolent provider and Silas was the grateful beneficiary. Instead, the dynamic had shifted in a way she couldn't quantify. Silas wasn't sulking, he wasn't distant, he was simply unbothered. He moved through the house with a lightness that irritated her, humming to himself while he made espresso in the mornings, offering her pleasant smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes, as if he were harboring a private joke she wasn't privy to. The first crock in her reality appeared on a Tuesday morning. They were standing in the kitchen, the morning light reflecting off the stainless steel appliances Josephine had imported from Germany. She was scrolling through her emails, already putting out fires for the merger, while Silas buttered a piece of toast. "I might be late tonight," he said casually, reaching for the coffee pot. "I have a site visit that's running long." As he extended his arm, the cuff of his shirt rode up. Josephine's eyes, trained to spot the smallest imperfection in a contract or a balance sheet, locked onto his wrist. It wasn't the battered Seiko he had worn since college. It was gold, rose gold specifically, with a ribbed horizontal dial that caught the light with a subtle, velvety sheen. Josephine froze, her phone hovering halfway to her ear. She knew watches. In her circles, a timepiece wasn't just an accessory, it was a resume on a wrist. "Is that new?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Silas glanced down, pulling his cuff back over the metal. This? No, just something I dug out of storage. Needed a change. Josephine watched him sip his coffee, her mind racing. That wasn't a department store find. The distinct shape of the bezel was unmistakable. As soon as Silas left for the garage, she unlocked her phone and typed a description into the search bar. Patek Philippe Nautilus, rose gold. The search result loaded, and Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. Retail, $55,000. Resale market, upwards of $130,000. She stared at the number, the zeros dancing mockingly before her eyes. That watch cost more than the luxury sedan she drove to the office. It cost more than Silas's entire annual salary as a junior architect. Storage, she whispered to the empty kitchen. He dug it out of storage. The logic didn't track. Silas's family were farmers from downstate, or so he had always implied. They didn't have six-figure heirlooms collecting dust in attic boxes. And if he had bought it himself, how? The question gnawed at her all day. She sat in board meetings, staring at pie charts, but all she could see was the rose gold glint on her husband's wrist. By the time she returned home that evening, the paranoia had set in, cold and hard. She found the house dark, save for the faint glow of the patio lights. Through the French doors of the living room, she saw Silas pacing in the garden. He had a glass of wine in one hand and his phone pressed to his ear with the other. Josephine kicked off her heels and moved silently across the plush carpet, pressing herself against the doorframe to listen. "The evaluation is too low, Rick," Silas was saying. His voice was different, harder, deeper. It wasn't the voice of the man who asked her what she wanted for dinner. It was the voice of a man giving orders. "No, tell the board I'm not interested in a split. We take the whole portfolio or we walk away. I don't care if they're nervous. Make them understand the leverage we hold." The board? Leverage? Portfolio? Josephine's breath hitched. Silas designed guest houses and kitchen renovations. He didn't deal with boards. He didn't have leverage. "No, I'll authorize the transfer in the morning. Just ensure the liquidity is there. I don't want any red flags when the purchase goes through." Josephine pulled back from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Authorize the transfer. She rushed upstairs to her home office, her hands trembling as she booted up her laptop. She needed to see the damage. If Silas was buying watches worth a fortune and talking about liquidity transfers, the money had to be coming from somewhere. And since he barely made enough to cover his own student loans, there was only one source she could think of. She logged into their joint checking account, the only financial tether that still connected them. She prepared herself for the horror, a drained balance, a series of massive withdrawals, a line of credit she hadn't approved. The screen loaded. Balance, $12,450. She blinked. It was exactly where it had been last week. She checked the savings, untouched. She checked the credit cards linked to the household expenses. Zero balance. She sat back in her ergonomic chair, staring at the blue light of the screen, more confused than relieved. If he wasn't stealing from her, where was the money coming from? A dark, icy realization began to form in the pit of her stomach. He wasn't stealing. He was borrowing. Gambling, she murmured, the word tasting like bile. It was the only explanation that fit the erratic behavior. The highs of a big win explaining the watch, the desperate late-night calls about liquidity and leverage, masking the terrifying reality of debts owed to dangerous people. Or perhaps it was crypto schemes, some desperate high-risk investment he had leveraged his identity for, trying to prove he was the big man she wanted him to be. Josephine closed the laptop with a snap. She had protected her assets with a prenup, yes, but debt was a different animal. If he was engaged in something illegal, if he owed money to loan sharks, they wouldn't care about a contract signed in a lawyer's office. They would come for the wife with the public profile and the deep pockets. She walked to the window, looking down at the garden where Silas was still pacing, looking so calm, so deceptively in control. "You fool," she whispered, her eyes narrowing. "You tried to play my game and you broke yourself." She couldn't let this slide. She couldn't just ask him. He would lie. Addicts and debtors always lied. She needed proof. She needed to know exactly how deep the hole was before the ground swallowed her whole. Josephine picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a number she had saved years ago, just in case. Daniel Trump, Private Investigations. She hesitated for only a second before hitting the call button. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Trump. Mr. Trump, this is Josephine Bond. I have a job for you. It concerns my husband. I need to know where he goes, who he talks to, and most importantly, where he's getting his money. Daniel Trump's office was located in a building that had likely been condemned twice and saved only by bribes. It sat in the shadow of the courthouse, a brick-and-mortar testament to the city's underbelly, smelling faintly of damp plaster and the kind of cheap cologne used to mask the scent of desperation. Josephine Bond stepped out of the elevator, her heels clicking against the linoleum with a rhythm that sounded entirely too expensive for this hallway. She adjusted her silk scarf, instinctively holding her breath as she pushed open the frosted glass door marked Trump Investigations. Inside, the air was thick with dust motes dancing and the shafts of light cutting through the blinds. Daniel Trump sat behind a metal desk that looked like it had survived a war, and perhaps it had. He was a man who wore his cynicism like a second skin, heavyset with eyes that had seen too many cheating spouses and embezzling partners to be surprised by anything. He didn't stand when she entered. He just watched her over the rim of a styrofoam coffee cup. Mrs. Bond, Trump grunted, gesturing vaguely to the vinyl chair opposite him. You're punctual. Most people in my line of work usually need a few minutes to work up the nerve in the hallway. Josephine remained standing, placing her pristine Birkin bag on the edge of his cluttered desk as if claiming territory. She didn't want to sit. Sitting implied they were equals, or worse, that she was a guest seeking hospitality. She was an employer, and he was a tool. I don't have time for nerves, Mr. Trump, Josephine said, her voice cool and detached. I have a situation that requires surgical precision. Trump set the coffee down. Precision costs extra. The standard rate gets you a hammer. You want a scalpel, we talk retainer. The money is not the issue, Josephine replied, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a thick envelope and slid it across the scratched metal surface. Competence is. My husband, Silas Bond, I need you to find out who he really is. Trump opened the envelope, thumbing through the stack of crisp bills with the practiced indifference of a blackjack dealer. He whistled low. That's a lot of paper for a husband. What's the angle? Cheating? Second family in the suburbs? I wish it were that simple. Infidelity I can handle. There are closets for that. This is financial. He's hiding something, Mr. Trump. Massive debts, gambling rings, perhaps money laundering. She laid out the evidence like a prosecutor presenting a closing argument. The sudden appearance of the Patek Philippe watch, the hushed, frantic phone calls in the garden about liquidity and leverage, the strange calmness he had displayed when signing the post-nuptial agreement, the behavior of a man who knew he had nothing left to lose, or perhaps a man who was planning a desperate exit strategy. He's an architect, Mr. Trump. He designs kitchen renovations for the upper middle class. He does not discuss portfolio valuations at midnight, Josephine said, her eyes narrowing. He's playing a role. I believe he's leveraged himself to the hilt trying to keep up appearances, or worse, he's dragged my name into some high-risk scheme to pay off sharks. Trump took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching loudly. So you want proof of debt. You want to know who holds the leash. I want leverage, Josephine corrected him sharply. If he crashes, I need to make sure he doesn't take me down with him. I need dirt, Mr. Trump. I need to know exactly how much he owes and to whom. If I have to divorce him to protect my company, I want the cause to be irrefutable. I want to be able to walk into a courtroom and prove that he is a fraud who married me for a lifeline. As she spoke, the narrative cemented itself in her mind. It made perfect sense now. Silas's lack of ambition, his contentment with his mediocre career, it had all been a cover. He wasn't a simple man, he was a parasite. He had likely been bleeding money for years, perhaps skimming from household accounts in ways she hadn't noticed until she tightened the screws with the prenup. Now that she had cut off his access to her future assets, the mask was slipping. The hostile takeover tone she had heard on the phone wasn't him doing business, it was him being squeezed by creditors. "I'll put a tail on him starting tonight," said Trump, tearing the sheet off the pad. "If he's meeting bookies or loan sharks, I'll get photos. If he's moving money he doesn't have, I'll find the paper trail. But I gotta warn you, Mrs. Bond, digging into a spouse's finances, sometimes you find things you wished stayed buried." "I value truth over comfort," Josephine lied. In reality, she valued control. The truth was just a means to reacquire it. "He drives a gray sedan," she added, standing up to leave. "He leaves the house at 7:30. Lately, he's been disappearing during lunch hours. He claims it's site visits, but his project log doesn't match the mileage." Trump nodded, tucking the envelope into a drawer. "I'll have a preliminary report in 48 hours. Keep your head down. Don't change your routine. If he's desperate, he'll be jumpy. You start asking questions, he might bolt." "He won't bolt," Josephine said, a cruel smile touching her lips. "He needs me. That's the only reason he's still here." She walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. As she descended in the elevator, she felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She wasn't the victim here. She was the proactive CEO managing a crisis. Silas thought he could play her. He thought he could hide his failures behind a rose gold watch and a smile. She would expose him. She would drag his secrets into the light. And when she finally served him the divorce papers, she would do so with a dossier of his incompetence on the table between them. She stepped out into the harsh sunlight of the street, checking her reflection in a shop window. She looked perfect, untouchable. She had no idea that the dirt she had just paid Daniel Trump to find wasn't the mud of a pigsty, but the gold dust of a dynasty that would soon blind her completely. Rain slicked the streets of Chicago, turning the asphalt into a mirror for the neon bar signs in the endless stream of brake lights. Daniel Trump sat in his unmarked Ford Taurus, the engine idling just enough to keep the heater running. He nursed a cup of lukewarm coffee that tasted like battery acid, his eyes fixed on the rear bumper of the gray sedan 3 cars ahead. He had been tailing Silas Bond for 2 days, and frankly, he was bored. The guy was a ghost. No bars, no strip clubs, no shady motels on the outskirts of town. Just work, the gym, and home. It was the routine of a choir boy or a man who knew he was being watched. But tonight, the routine had broken. Instead of turning left toward the suburbs in the icy silence of the Bond residence, Silas had signaled right, merging onto the expressway toward the heart of the financial district. "Finally," Trump muttered, crushing the styrofoam cup and tossing it into the passenger footwell. "Show me the mistress, Silas. Show me the bookie." But Silas didn't pull up to a hotel or a back-alley gambling den. He navigated the grid of the city center with practiced ease, eventually pulling his modest sedan into the valet lane of the Millennium Spire. Trump whistled low as he pulled to the curb a block away, raising his telephoto lens. The Spire was glass and steel arrogance, a building that housed hedge funds, investment banks, and on the top 5 floors, the law firm of Snyder and Associates. Trump knew Snyder and Associates. They didn't handle divorces or DUIs. They handled mergers, acquisitions, and the kind of estate planning that involved hiding GDP-sized sums of money in offshore accounts. You didn't walk into that lobby unless your net worth had 2 commas, or unless you were being sued by someone who did. Through the viewfinder, the camera shutter clicking rapidly, Trump watched as the valet opened Silas's door. Silas stepped out, smoothed his jacket, and handed the keys over. He didn't look like a nervous debtor facing a lawsuit. He walked past the security desk with a nod that was returned with familiar deference by the guard, and headed straight for the private elevator bank reserved for executive clients. "What are you playing at, architect?" Trump whispered, reviewing the digital images. A junior architect didn't have business at Snyder and Associates at 7 in the evening unless he was delivering something, or stealing something. Trump waited. An hour later, Silas emerged, not alone, but flanked by 2 men. One was an older gentleman with silver hair, Rick Snyder himself, a legal shark Trump had only seen in newspapers. The other was a younger man carrying a rolled tube of blueprints. They shook hands on the sidewalk, a gesture of equal standing, before Silas got back into his car. The tale continued. This time, they moved south toward the riverfront where the city's skyline was currently being dissected by cranes. The target was the old naval yards, a massive redevelopment project that had been stalled in zoning hell for years. It was a wasteland of mud and steel girders surrounded by chain-link fences. Silas parked near the construction trailer. Trump killed his lights and parked in the shadows of an overpass. He swapped his camera lens for a longer range one. Silas met with a group of men in hard hats and expensive overcoats. They weren't yelling at him for late payments. They were gathered around him in a tight circle, pointing at the skeletal structure of a rising tower. Silas was doing the talking. He pointed at the girders, then at the river, making sweeping gestures. The men nodded, taking notes. One of them, a guy Trump recognized as a union boss who didn't take orders from anyone, was listening to Silas with rapt attention. This wasn't a site visit for a kitchen remodel. This was ownership. Or, looking at it through the lens Josephine Bond had paid him to use, this was recon. The realization hit Trump. Josephine had said Silas was an architect. Architects had access to plans, to structural weaknesses, to proprietary designs. If Silas was drowning in debt, he might be selling inside information, selling the layout of a competitor's building, or perhaps consulting off the books for a rival developer in violation of his contract. Trump snapped a final series of photos. Silas laughing with the union boss, Silas shaking hands with the foreman, Silas looking up at the massive steel skeleton like he owned the sky above it. 2 hours later, Josephine Bond sat in the passenger seat of Trump's car, parked in the deserted lot of a 24-hour diner. She refused to let him come to the house, and she wouldn't meet her at her office. She flipped through the printed photographs, her face illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the street lamp. "Snyder and Associates," she said, her finger tracing the logo on the glass door in the first photo. Her voice was tight. "That's the most expensive firm in the city. They represent the monolithic corporations. Why is Silas there?" "He's not there for a parking ticket, Mrs. Bond," Trump said, chewing on a toothpick. "And look at who walked him out. That's Rick Snyder. He doesn't walk clients to the curb unless they're billing 1,000 hours a month." Josephine flipped to the next photo, the construction site. She saw Silas commanding the room, the confidence in his posture, the way the other men orbited him. "This is the Naval Yard project," she murmured. "It's a billion-dollar development. My company tried to bid on the interior wellness centers for the residential units, but we were locked out. They said they had a private developer." "Exactly," Trump said, turning in his seat to face her. "Look, I've seen guys hide gambling debts. I've seen guys hiding girlfriends. This isn't that. Your husband isn't looking over his shoulder. He's walking into high-security buildings and restricted construction zones like he belongs there." "So what are you saying?" Josephine asked, though her eyes were already hardening with a conclusion. "I'm saying he's selling something," Trump theorized, his cynicism filling in the blanks. "Maybe he's an architect, right? He knows zoning laws, he knows structural specs. Maybe he's consulting on the side for a competitor. Or maybe it's worse. Maybe he's feeding proprietary info from his current firm to these developers for a cut. That's why he needs the high-end lawyers to protect him when the SEC or the feds come knocking." Josephine stared at the photo of Silas shaking hands with the union boss. "Corporate espionage," she whispered. It fit the sudden influx of cash for the watch. It fit the secretive phone calls about leverage and boards. He wasn't a gambler, he was a criminal. He was using his professional license to facilitate illegal deals or sell trade secrets. "He's involved in something big, Mrs. Bond," Trump said gravely. "People don't meet with Snyder and the union in the same night unless they're moving serious weight. If he's taking kickbacks or selling data and he gets caught, the fallout will be nuclear. They'll freeze his assets. They'll come after the spouse." Josephine shoved the photos into her purse, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with fury. "He's risking everything. He's risking her reputation, her company, just to play at being a big shot." "He's laundering money," she said, her voice cold as ice. "That's why he signed the prenup so easily. He didn't want me looking at his accounts because they're dirty. He's not protecting me. He's hiding evidence." "If you want to cut him loose," Trump advised, "you do it now, before the indictments come down." "Don't worry, Mr. Trump," Josephine said, opening the car door. "I'm not just going to cut him loose. I'm going to make sure when he falls, he doesn't drag me down an inch." She stepped out into the night, armed with the wrong truth, ready to destroy the man who was currently building her a kingdom she was too blind to see. The morning sun that usually bathed Josephine's corner office in a triumphant golden glow felt harsh and interrogating today. Josephine stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the Bond Wellness Group headquarters, looking out at the sprawling metropolis she fought every day to conquer. Her headache was a dull, rhythmic thumping behind her eyes, a physical manifestation of the letter that lay open on her glass desk. It was on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of stationery used to deliver bad news politely. Notice of lease renegotiation. The management group, a faceless entity that had acquired the building 3 days ago, was exercising a clause in her commercial lease she had thought was ironclad. They were hiking the rent, not by 5%, not by 10%, by 40%. 40%, she hissed to the empty room, turning back to glare at the paper. It's extortion. She had spent the last hour screaming at her CFO, demanding to know how this had happened, how they hadn't seen the acquisition coming. A hike this steep would eat into her operational margins for the entire fiscal year. It would freeze her expansion plans. It would make her look weak to the board. She sat down, her fingers massaging her temples. The timing was too precise. Her company had just released its quarterly earnings, showing record profits but tight liquidity due to the new product line launch. Whoever this new landlord was, they knew exactly how much blood they could squeeze from the stone without killing the business. They knew her vulnerabilities. Her eyes drifted to the other stack of papers on her desk, the manila envelope Daniel Trump had given her the night before. The photos spilled out like a deck of accursed tarot cards. Silas entering the Snyder and Associates tower, Silas shaking hands with the union boss at the naval yard, Silas looking like a king surveying his domain. The pieces of the puzzle, previously scattered by confusion, suddenly snapped together with a terrifying magnetic clarity. Trump's voice echoed in her mind. He's involved in something big, maybe corporate espionage. Josephine picked up the photo of Silas with Rick Snyder. Snyder and Associates wasn't just an estate planning firm. They were sharks in commercial real estate law. They represented the biggest developers in the city, the kind of developers who bought skyscrapers and squeezed tenants. Her breath hitched. Silas was an architect. He had access to her home office. He saw the files she brought home, the confidential projections, the lease agreements, the vulnerability reports. He knew about the liquidity crunch before the shareholders did. He told them, she whispered, the realization feeling like a physical blow to the gut. It made sickening sense. Silas wasn't just gambling or laundering money. He was selling her. He had likely approached a developer, maybe the very group developing that naval yard, or the new owners of this building, and offered up her company's internal data as a sweetener. He had told them exactly how high they could raise the rent. He had likely consulted on the valuation of the building itself, using his knowledge of her tenancy to inflate the price. That's where the money for the Patek Philippe came from. It wasn't a loan, it was a consulting fee, a kickback for betraying his wife. She stood up, pacing the length of the office, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. The betrayal was so absolute it left her dizzy. She had protected her assets with a prenup, thinking he was a passive leech who would simply drain her slowly. She hadn't realized he was an active predator, dismantling her empire from the inside out to line his own pockets. She thought of his smile at dinner when he signed the document. That wasn't the smile of a defeated man. It was the smile of a spy who knew he had already planted the bomb. "I don't need your money, Josephine," he had said. Of course he didn't. He was making a fortune selling her secrets. She grabbed her phone, her thumb hovering over the dial button for her lawyer. She wanted to file a restraining order. She wanted to have security escort him from the house, but legal action took time, and accusations required proof. No, she wouldn't let him hide behind lawyers. She wouldn't let him play the innocent, bumbling husband 1 minute longer. She looked at the lease notice again. The new landlord was listed as Obsidian HDL LLC, a shell company, the coward's shield. And somewhere behind that shield, she was certain, was the shadow of Silas Bond, whispering her secrets to men in expensive suits. She swept the photos and the lease notice into her briefcase with a violent motion. She was done analyzing. She was done investigating. The narrative was complete in her mind. Silas was a traitor.
He was using her success to fund his delusions of grandeur, trading on her intimacy to strip mine her business. She checked her time. It was 5:30 p.m. He would be home soon, likely pouring himself a glass of wine, wearing that maddeningly calm expression, waiting for her to come home and tell him about her hard day, secretly gloating that he was the cause of it. "You want to play hardball, Silas?" she said to the empty room, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. "I invented the game." She grabbed her coat and marched out of the office. She didn't say goodbye to her assistant. She didn't check her schedule for tomorrow. She had only one appointment that mattered now. She was going home to evict her husband from her life, and she was going to enjoy every second of watching his smug, deceitful facade crumble when she revealed she knew exactly what he was. As the elevator descended, Josephine checked her bank balance one last time, reassuring herself of her power. She had millions. She had the prenup. She held all the cards. She had no idea that she was rushing home to accuse a man of stealing crumbs when he actually owned the bakery.
The front door of the townhouse didn't just open. It struck the wall with a violence that rattled the crystal chandelier in the foyer. Josephine didn't bother to close it. She marched into the living room, the heels of her Louboutins driving into the hardwood like nails into a coffin. The house was quiet, disturbingly so, filled with the soft, mournful notes of a jazz record spinning on the vintage turntables Silas loved so much. He was sitting in his usual leather armchair, a book open on his lap, a glass of Bordeaux resting on the side table. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm, infuriatingly unbothered by the hurricane that had just swept into his sanctuary. "You're home early," Silas said, marking his page. "I was about to—" "Don't," Josephine cut him off, her voice vibrating with a cold, lethal rage. "Don't play the doting husband. The show is over, Silas. The curtain has dropped." She marched to the center of the room and upended her briefcase. The manila envelope Daniel Trump had given her slid out, and with a flick of her wrist, she sent the photograph scattering across the coffee table and onto the Persian rug. Glossy black and white images of Silas entering the Snyder Tower, Silas shaking hands with union bosses, Silas surveying the construction site like a conqueror. Silas looked down at the photos, his brow furrowing slightly, not with guilt but with a weary sort of disappointment. He reached for the one showing him with Rick Snyder, studying it for a moment before placing it gently back on the table. "You had me followed," he said softly. It wasn't a question. "I had you investigated," Josephine corrected, stepping closer until she was towering over him. "And thank God I did. I knew you were hiding something, but I gave you too much credit. I thought you were just a gambler. I thought maybe you were drowning in debt and too proud to ask for help. But you're not a victim, are you? You're a parasite." "Is that what you see in these pictures?" Silas asked, meeting her gaze. "I see a traitor," I spat. "I see a mediocre architect who realized he could make more money selling his wife's secrets than he ever could designing guest houses. Did you think I wouldn't put it together? The sudden meetings with high-powered real estate attorneys, the secret trips to the naval yard?" She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "And then today happened. My rent went up, Silas, 40%. A shell company called Obsidian Holdings acquired my building and immediately tried to bleed me dry. And who gave them the numbers? Who told them exactly what my margins were? Who handed them the leverage to squeeze me?" She pointed a manicured finger at his chest. "You did. You've been consulting for them. You're the inside man. That's how you paid for the Patek Philippe, isn't it? Kickbacks. You sold me out for a watch." Silas stared at her, his eyes searching her face as if looking for some trace of the woman he had married beneath the layers of paranoia and greed. "You think I'm selling your corporate secrets to pay for a watch?" "I think you felt small," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "I think you hated that I was the one with the power, the one with the money, so you decided to steal some of it. You thought you could play in the big leagues, make some side cash by betraying the person who puts a roof over your head." She turned away from him, pacing the room, fueled by the adrenaline of her own righteousness. "Well, congratulations, Silas. You played yourself. You forgot about the prenup. You forgot about that little document you signed so arrogantly at dinner." She spun back around, her eyes blazing. "That agreement explicitly states that any earnings derived from illicit activities or breaches of marital confidentiality are forfeit. But it doesn't even matter because I'm triggering the separation clause tonight." Silas remained seated, his stillness a stark contrast to her frenetic energy. "You're kicking me out?" "I'm evicting you," Josephine declared. "You have 1 hour to pack a bag, and I mean a small bag. You leave the watch, you leave anything I paid for. You walk out of here with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing. No alimony, no settlement, no claim on the house. You signed it all away, remember? You were so eager to prove you didn't care about the money. Well, now you get to live without it." She waited for the begging. She waited for him to panic, to realize that his scheme had blown up in his face, to apologize and claim he only did it because he felt neglected. She wanted his desperation. She needed to see him broken so she could feel secure again. But Silas didn't break. He slowly closed his book and set it on the table next to the damning photographs. He stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket, and for the first time, Josephine noticed how tall he actually was. He seemed to fill the room, his presence expanding until her anger felt small and shrill against it. "You really believe this narrative you've constructed," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You looked at a man meeting with lawyers and builders, and the only explanation your mind could conjure was betrayal. It never occurred to you that I might be building something of my own? It never occurred to you to just ask me?" "Ask you?" Josephine scoffed. "Liars lie, Silas, and I don't deal in stories. I deal in facts. The fact is, you're meeting with my enemies. The fact is, you have money you shouldn't have. The fact is, you're done." "The fact is," Silas interrupted, his voice hardening into steel, "you are so blinded by your own reflection that you can't see anything else. You wanted a prenup to protect yourself from a gold digger. You humiliated me to get it. And even after I signed it, even after I gave you total security, you couldn't trust me. You hired a stranger to stalk me." He walked past her toward the hallway, stopping right next to her. He didn't look at her, he looked at the wall where a painting she had bought for investment purposes hung. "I'll pack a bag," Silas said, "but not because you're kicking me out. I'm leaving because I finally have the answer to the question I've been asking myself for 5 years." "And what question is that?" Josephine challenged, crossing her arms. "Whether you loved me or just the control you had over me." Silas finally turned to look at her, and the pity in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, distant finality. "Enjoy the house, Josephine. It's the only thing you have left." Josephine watched him walk up the stairs, his footsteps steady and unhurried. She felt a flicker of unease in her chest, a tiny crack in her armor of certainty. Why wasn't he fighting for the assets? Why wasn't he terrified of being destitute? She shook it off. He was bluffing. He was trying to save face. He would be back in an hour, begging on his knees once the reality of the cold street hit him. She poured herself a glass of his wine, standing over the scoured photographs of his treachery, completely unaware that she had just evicted the only man who could have saved her from the storm she had created. Josephine was midway through her second glass of wine, savoring the silence of her victory, when the heavy thud of a car door closing outside shattered the quiet. She checked her watch. It had been 40 minutes. Perhaps the taxi she hadn't called for him had finally arrived, or perhaps Daniel Trump had sent a courier with more evidence to bury him. She walked to the bay window, expecting to see a yellow cab idling at the curb. Instead, a sleek black Maybach stretched across the length of their driveway, its polished chrome gleaming under the streetlights like a predator's teeth. A driver in a cap was already holding the rear door open, but no one was getting in. Instead, a man was walking up the path toward her front door. Josephine recognized the silver hair and the confident stride immediately. It was Rick Snyder, the accomplice from the photographs. "The audacity," she whispered, her grip tightening on the wineglass. Silas hadn't just packed, he had called for backup. He was bringing his co-conspirator into her house to negotiate a surrender. She moved to the foyer just as the doorbell rang. She threw the door open, ready to unleash the fury of a CEO scorned. "Mr. Snyder," she greeted him, her voice dripping with ice. "I assume you're here to represent my husband in the criminal proceedings I intend to file. You can tell him to save his legal fees. I'm not interested in a settlement." Rick Snyder didn't flinch. He looked at her with the same impassive expression he wore in boardrooms where companies were bought and sold. He held a thick leather briefcase in one hand and a single cream-colored envelope in the other. Good evening, Mrs. Bond, Rick said, stepping past her into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. I am not a criminal defense attorney, Josephine, and I'm certainly not here to negotiate a plea. I'm here to facilitate the transition. Transition? Josephine slammed the door shut and followed him into the living room. The only transition happening tonight is Silas moving from my house to the street. I know about the kickbacks, Snyder. I know about the naval yard. I know he's been selling my data to Obsidian Holdings. At the mention of the shell company, a flicker of amusement crossed Rick's face. He set his briefcase on the coffee table, right on top of the scattered surveillance photos Josephine had thrown at Silas earlier. Obsidian Holdings, Rick repeated, unlatching the brass clasps of his case. A very aggressive firm. They recently acquired a significant commercial portfolio in the downtown district, including, I believe, the Bond Wellness Tower. Don't play coy, Josephine snapped. My husband fed me the data so you could jack up my rent. You're squeezing me for cash because his gambling debts, or whatever hole he's dug himself into, are getting too deep. Josephine. The voice came from the stairs. Silas was descending, carrying a single battered leather duffel bag. He had changed out of his suit into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking less like an evicted husband and more like a man leaving a hotel he had outgrown. He walked into the room and stood beside Rick. The dynamic shifted instantly. In the photos, they had looked like conspirators. Standing here now, they looked like a king and his hand. There are no debts, Silas said quietly. There were no kickbacks. I didn't sell your secrets to Obsidian Holdings, Joe. I am Obsidian Holdings. Josephine froze. The words hung in the air, nonsensical and heavy. What? Rick Snyder pulled a document from his briefcase and slid it across the table. It wasn't a legal threat. It was a deed of trust, stamped with a seal that looked centuries old. Silas is the sole beneficiary of the Anthony Bond estate, Rick explained, his tone professional and crisp. The trust was activated on his 45th birthday. It includes the family's diversified holdings in shipping, commercial real estate, and venture capital. The current valuation of the estate sits comfortably north of $4 billion. Josephine stared at the document. She saw the numbers, she saw the name Anthony Bond. She saw Silas's signature, the same elegant script he had used to sign the prenup, authorized at the bottom. $4 billion? The word felt foreign in her mouth. But the naval yard. Silas bought the naval yard, Rick corrected. He's the private developer you were so worried about. And yes, through the Obsidian Shell Company, he purchased the building your company leases. The rent hike was an automated adjustment by the property management algorithm based on market value. Silas didn't even know about it until you started screaming about espionage. The room seemed to tilt. Josephine looked at Silas, really looked at him for the first time in years. The calm demeanor wasn't passivity, it was the patience of a man who owned the horizon. The lack of ambition wasn't laziness, it was the quiet contentment of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. You, she stammered, her mind scrambling to rewrite the last 5 years of their marriage. You have billions? And you let me pay for dinner? You let me worry about the mortgage? I wanted to be your partner, not your ATM, Silas said, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than anger. I wanted to know that you were with me for me. My grandfather's will was specific. I couldn't touch the money or reveal it until I was sure of my partner's character. He gestured to the scattered photos of him being stalked by her private investigator. I guess I got my answer. Josephine's knees felt weak. She sank onto the sofa, the realization washing over her like a tidal wave. He wasn't a leech, he was a whale, and she had treated him like a servant. But then, a desperate, clawing hope seized her. She was his wife. They were married. $4 billion? Even if they divorced, half of that was... We're married, she whispered, looking up at him, her survival instinct kicking in. Silas, this is a shock, but we can work this out. We're partners. That money, it's ours. Rick Snyder cleared his throat. The sound was dry and final, like a gavel striking wood.
He picked up the cream-colored envelope he had brought in, the copy of the post-nuptial agreement Josephine had forced Silas to sign. "Actually, Mrs. Bond," Rick said, opening the folder, "it isn't. You were quite specific in your drafting. Clause 4, Section B. All assets acquired by either party, whether by inheritance, gift, or industry, shall remain the sole and separate property of the acquiring spouse, free from any claim by the other." Rick looked at her over his reading glasses. "You insisted on this clause to protect your spa franchise. You were terrified Silas would claim a share of your $10 million. In doing so, you have legally waived any right to the Bond estate. Every penny of the $4 billion belongs to Silas. You are entitled to nothing. No alimony, no support, no settlement." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. She had built a fortress to keep him out, and she had inadvertently locked herself out of the treasury. She had fought to save her pennies and lost the kingdom. "Technically," Rick mused, glancing at the lease notice on the table, "given the new rental rates on your corporate headquarters and the debt service on your expansion, Silas is now the only thing keeping your company solvent. If he chooses to enforce the lease terms, you could be facing bankruptcy by Q3. Josephine looked at Silas, her eyes wide with horror. She wasn't just the wife who had been wrong, she was the pauper. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted completely. She was the one who needed him. She was the dependent. "Silas, you wouldn't let me go under. We're family." "Family trusts," Silas said, turning toward the door. "Business partners verify. And you made it very clear tonight, Josephine. We are not partners. We are just two people with separate assets." He walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind him. Josephine sat alone in the silent house, the prenup lying on the table next to the photos of the billionaire she had just evicted, realizing that in her desperate bid to protect herself from being used, she had become the very thing she despised, a woman left with nothing but her pride, and even that was worthless now.
The heavy oak door clicked shut, and the sound reverberated through the foyer like a gunshot, signaling the end of life as Josephine Bond knew it. She stood frozen on the Persian rug, the silence of the house rushing in to fill the space Silas had occupied. For years, she had complained that he was too quiet, too passive, too much of a background character in the movie of her life. Now, his absence felt massive, a suffocating void that sucked the air right out of her lungs. Outside, the low purr of the Maybach's engine rumbled to life. It was a sound of immense power and luxury, a sound that belonged to a world she had spent her entire career trying to claw her way into. And it was driving away with her husband inside. Rick Snyder stood by the coffee table, snapping the latches of his briefcase shut. He looked at Josephine not with the contempt she deserved, but with the dispassionate gaze of an undertaker closing a casket. "He truly loved you, you know," Rick said, his voice cutting through the fog in her brain. "He waited 5 years to claim his inheritance because he wanted to be sure you wouldn't feel overshadowed by it. He wanted you to feel successful on your own terms. It's a tragedy that you couldn't offer him the same courtesy." Josephine looked down at the coffee table. The cream-colored envelope containing the post-nuptial agreement lay there, innocent and deadly. Next to it were the photos of Silas, not cheating, not gambling, but building a future, building an empire, and all the while she had been treating him like a termite eating away at her foundation. It wasn't the loss of the $4 billion that made her knees buckle, it was the memory of his face just before he turned away. He hadn't looked angry, he had looked relieved. He was relieved to be free of her judgment, free of her constant need to measure his worth against a balance sheet. "I evicted him," she whispered, the horror of her own actions finally piercing the armor of her arrogance. "I kicked him out because I thought he was stealing from me. And he was paying my rent." She looked at Rick, tears finally blurring the sharp edges of the room. "I'm not the victim here, am I?" "No, Mrs. Bond," Rick said softly. "You are the architect of your own ruin." The rumble of the car engine grew louder as it shifted into gear. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Josephine's chest. If that car left the driveway, he was gone.
Not just for the night, forever. He had the means to disappear. He could fly to Paris, Tokyo, or a private island tonight. He could erase her from his life with a signature on a check. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. For the first time in her adult life, Josephine Bond didn't weigh the risks or analyze the ROI. She simply reacted. She grabbed the post-nuptial agreement from the table and sprinted for the door. She burst out into the cool night air, her heels skidding on the damp pavement. The Maybach was already moving, rolling slowly down the long, winding driveway toward the gate. "Silas!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and unpolished. "Silas, wait!" She ran past the meticulously manicured hedges she used to yell at him for not trimming perfectly. She ran past the fountain he had fixed with his own hands because she refused to call a repairman for simple tasks. Her breath burned in her lungs, and her hair whipped across her face, blinding her. The taillights of the car were pulling away. He wasn't stopping. Why would he? She had given him nothing to stay for. "Silas, please," she cried out again, her voice breaking. "Stop!" Whether it was the driver seeing her in the rearview mirror or Silas offering one last act of mercy, the brake lights flared bright red. The massive car came to a halt just feet from the iron gates. Josephine didn't slow down until she reached the rear passenger window. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving, her pristine white suit stained with the mist of the evening. She banged her fist against the tinted glass. "Open the door," she sobbed. "Please, just open the door." The window didn't roll down. The door didn't open. She could see his silhouette through the dark glass, motionless. "I don't care about the money," she yelled at the glass, desperate to make him hear the truth before he drove out of her life. "I don't care about the trust or the building or any of it. I was scared, Silas. I was so scared that I was the only one holding everything up, and if I slipped, we'd both drown. I projected all of that fear onto you. I made you small so I could feel big enough to handle the pressure." The window remained closed. "I love you," she screamed, the words ripping through her dignity. "I loved you when you were an architect making 50 grand a year. I loved you when I thought you were a gambler. I loved you even when I was hating you tonight, because the thought of you betraying me hurt more than losing the business ever could." She held up the document in her hand, the prenup, the symbol of her control, the weapon she had used to humiliate him. "You signed this to prove you didn't need my money," she said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "I'm going to destroy it to prove I don't need yours." With shaking hands, she gripped the thick cardstock. She tore it down the middle. The sound was sharp and final. She stacked the halves and tore them again and again until the contract that protected his billions and her millions was nothing but confetti in her hands. She let the pieces fall to the wet pavement, watching as the wind scattered the clauses and stipulations into the darkness. "I don't want a contract," she wept, leaning her forehead against the cold glass of the car window. "I just want my husband. If you leave, take the house, take the company. I don't want any of it if I have to be in it alone." She slid down until she was kneeling on the driveway, stripped of her pride, her assets, and her defenses. She closed her eyes, waiting for the sound of the engine revving, waiting for the tires to spray gravel in her face as he left her in the dust of her own making. Instead, she heard the click of a lock. The heavy door swung open. Silas stepped out. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like a billionaire staring down a beggar. He looked at the torn pieces of paper on the ground, then down at the woman kneeling in the dirt. He crouched down, ignoring the damp ground on his expensive jeans, until he was eye level with her. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch warm and familiar. "You realized that by tearing that up, you just made yourself liable for half of my debts if I really was a gambler," Silas said softly. Josephine let out a wet, choked laugh that turned into a sob. "I'll pay them. I'll work. I'll start over. I don't care." Silas studied her face, searching for the truth. He had spent a lifetime watching people, learning to read the microscopic tells that revealed their character. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the surrender. The wall was gone. The CEO was gone. Only Josephine remained. "Get up, Joe," he whispered, taking her hands. He pulled her to her feet. She was shivering, though the night wasn't cold. He took off his cashmere jacket and draped it over her shoulders, a gesture so simple, yet it carried the weight of a promise kept. "I don't need you to fix me, Silas," she said, her voice steadying, "but I need you to forgive me, and I need you to let me earn my way back. I don't want your charity. I want to be your partner, for real this time." Silas looked past her, toward the house where Rick Snyder was watching from the porch. He nodded once to the lawyer, then turned back to his wife. Partners split the risk, and they share the rewards, but mostly they tell each other the truth. Can you do that? Can you stop trying to win the marriage and just live in it? "I can. I promise. I will." Silas wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. For the first time in months, Josephine didn't feel the need to stiffen her spine or check her posture. She melted into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a heart that she had almost broken, a heart that was worth more than all the steel and glass in the city. "Let's go inside," Silas said, guiding her toward the house. "It's freezing out here, and I believe you owe your landlord a drink." Josephine laughed, a genuine sound that echoed in the night air. As they walked back up the driveway, leaving the Maybach idling and the torn paper behind them, the road ahead would be difficult. She had to learn to trust, and he had to learn to lead openly. But for the first time, she wasn't walking alone. She was walking beside a king, and finally she was ready to be a queen worthy of the crown, not because of the gold in the vault, but because of the love that survived the fire.